See everybody. Some people are still signing in. So, first of all, sorry we couldn't do it. For those who like to come to the in-person, sorry it wasn't possible today. But with the, I guess, scheduled construction, it didn't make sense. It would have been too loud. But next class should be back. It's in next class is sometime in a few weeks, so that should be fine. But let's see. So I had said, during the first class that we won't do a long meditation at the beginning of this series of classes, because really the whole text is in my view, a meditation. It's the study of it, contemplating of it, everything is a meditation. But still, it's good to pause and just bring to mind bodhicitta for a moment. And actually for the whole class, we should have bodhicitta. Actually, for our whole lives, we should have bodhicitta, of course. The practice, the core practice. And we're going to you'll see bodhicitta is connected to refuge. And today's class is going to focus on the Uttara Tantra's sort of exploration and explanation of refuge. And as we study that, you'll see that actually bodhicitta is includes a form of refuge practice. But so in brief, right, we remember that bodhicitta, right, is grounded in a sense of compassion, love and compassion that includes all sentient beings, ourselves and all others. We're studying Dharma. And today we're going to really I hope, for me anyway, the topics for today really inspire some kind of understanding and feeling about how, study is a form of practice, and practice includes study. They're interconnected. So, anyway, so bringing to mind that sense of compassion and bodhicitta. We'll do our verse of refuge and bodhicitta, and then one way the whole class day will be an exploration of this topic. So, and the 7 Vajra points as they relate to it. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So actually, when we say that, right, I mean, if you go to whatever Buddhist tradition, you may even if you go to if you see practitioners of any Buddhist tradition, right, in each language, right, there's refuge. You just did it, right? I go for English, right? I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. In Tibetan, actually, sometimes I'll chant it in Sanskrit, right? Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya. Or if you're in the Pali tradition, they have their own way, right? Anyway, they're not. So I pause, I'll remember it. But anyway, there's Pali chants. They're in Tibetan, there are chants and so on for refuge. Actually, what does it mean to take refuge in the Buddha, or the Dharma, or the Sangha? I'm just asking us to pause and contemplate that, right? And one question I'll ask, as we're about to get into this, is, when we take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, actually, first of all, just notice what comes to mind for you when you do. We just did that verse, right? So think back, what was that like for you? And how do you think about what is that object of refuge? Those 3 objects of refuge, right? The 3 jewels. So when you say to yourself in a practice or in the beginning of a class, or if you're sitting down at home to meditate or somewhere, right, and you say, I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Actually, what does that mean to you? So first, think about that. And one question I'll ask is also, are those, we're going to explore this in a minute, but are those, when you say Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are you taking refuge in something outside of you? Like in the continuum of another person, being? or are you taking refuge in something that's going to arise within yourself? Or if you're, or you think of it as something that already exists within yourself, for example. Anyway, these are questions that the Uttara Tantra explores, right? So what does it mean when you say I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha? And how do they protect you, right? How can they protect you? And anyway, those are interesting questions, aren't they? Just to start to think about what refuge means protection, right? Like I'm subject to suffering or dissatisfaction or problems or pain or loss or all kinds of problems, right? So how can the three jewels, can they protect us? If so, how can they? Again, these are all questions to contemplate and questions that the Uttara Tantra explores in really quite interesting ways. And I want to relate that now to the 7 Vajra points, because that's where we left off, right? The text we were starting to study, right? The actual text of the Uttara Tantra. And by the way, I'll just mention this briefly. Last time I said, Uttara Tantra, right? Our translator, right, is the Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra, right? That's the name of the text. And last time I explained like the meaning of it, sublime, according to the way this translator did it, the sublime continuum, right? Which is, there's the sublime continuum of your Buddha nature, which is, which already exists within you. And then there's also this sublime continuum at the resultant state, right, of the continuum of enlightened activities and enlightened qualities and so on. Some actually, it's interesting. Some commentaries have a different gloss on the title. They say Uttara. Uttara usually is translated like sublime or unsurpassed or best, but it can also mean final, like the final. And then and that when they gloss it that way, then they'll say Tantra is like teaching. So then they'll say it's the final teaching, meaning it's a commentary on the third turning of the wheel of Dharma. There were 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, right? The first was when the Buddha taught mainly the 4 Noble Truths, right? His first teaching. And then the second turning of the wheel of Dharma were the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And then they say the third turning, sometimes they'll say the third turning of the wheel of Dharma was teachings on Buddha nature, primarily. So this is a commentary on Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha, like the well-gone one's essence, or the womb, the seed, the seed of the one gone. Thus, so another way of glossing that title is also this is a commentary on Buddha nature. So those are both accurate. Gyaltsab Je prefers the one I said last time. He prefers the understanding the title as the best, the unsurpassed, the sublime continuum as a reference to our Buddha nature. But anyway, there are different commentaries explained it different ways, but they're all correct, and just thought to mention that. But then, okay, so we got up to the 7 Vajra topics, or 7 Vajra points, here they describe them, right? And I'll just remind us, right, that they're listed in chapter 1, verse 3, right? From the Buddha, the Dharma. From the Dharma, the assembly of Aryas, Sangha. From the assembly, the Tathagata essence. The exalted wisdom is attained upon ending of the element, the ending of the element. Attainment of this exalted wisdom is seeking supreme enlightenment endowed with attributes of powers and so on that bring up forth the welfare of all sentient beings. Page. Yeah. So and actually they're listed in a briefer way at the very beginning, the body of the text, where it says identifying the that verse kind of explains them more poetically. And the very first verse says identifying the entities of the 7 Vajra topics, which just lists Buddha, Dharma, assembly, basic element, enlightenment, excellent qualities, and finally enlightened activities. So those are the 7 Vajra points, or 7 Vajra topics that are covered or explained in the entire text of the Uttara Tantra. So the first 3, right, are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So that connects back, right? We just said, I go for refuge, right? Dharma and Sangha. So this is exploring those. And so Gyaltsab Je, in his commentary to this text, says that, I've got it to the right page and everything. So he says, he points out that Nok Lotsawa, who's so Lotsawa means a beautiful term, actually, in Tibetan, like Marpa Lotsawa, Nok Lotsawa. It's a title, actually. The Lotsawa is a title, which means the eyes of the world, which is a beautiful, I think, description. Oh, if somebody has the text online, if you could, Lisa asked if somebody could put it in the chat, that'd be great. I have it in hard copy here, but I sent, Jan has it, I think. Jan sent it around, but if it's convenient for somebody, if they can put it, the link in the chat, that'd be great. But so Gyaltsab Je points, so Lotsawa, I was finishing that. So Lotsawa means eyes of the world, and it refers to translators. So that what it's actually saying is that great translators of the Dharma are like the eyes of the world, in the sense that they allow us to see, right? To see the truth. Because if somebody didn't translate the words, right, of the Buddha into different languages, then those of us who don't speak or read, the original languages wouldn't be able to study them. So yeah, so that's the meaning of Lotsawa. So that's Lotsawa. So he points out that Nok Lotsawa had two ways of interpreting, if you read it here, composed two modes of exposition, one from the perspective of the wheel of unlocated nirvana, and the other from the perspective of the wheel of jewels. Beautiful poetic phrasing. But what he's getting at there is that there are two ways of looking at how to relate these seven Vajra points to each other. And Gyaltsab Je doesn't take issue with them. He says they're both reasonable, so I'll present them both. But he prefers one to the other. So I'm going to do the one he prefers first, because that's Gyaltsab Je's preferred interpretation. He thinks it's the more meaningful one. And so that interpretation is like this. When we say the three jewels, right, the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, and the Sangha jewel, he says, mainly we're talking about in your continuum. So not in the continuum of others who have already achieved enlightenment, but it's referring mainly to, so in other words, in this context, this way of interpreting it is what we call resultant refuge. It's an interesting term, isn't it? There's a causal refuge, and sometimes we say there's the causal version of taking refuge and the resultant version of taking refuge. The resultant version of taking refuge actually is quite meaningful, isn't it? It's that when you say, I take refuge in the Buddha, in this sense, right, as a resultant refuge, it means that you're taking refuge in your own eventual attainment of Buddhahood. And when you take refuge in the Dharma, right, it's that you're actually taking refuge in your own your own future complete realization of the Dharma. And in the Sangha, you will be the Sangha, right, in that sense. So so the resultant refuge is actually taking refuge in those three things as they will arise in the future in your own continuum of being, in your own mental continuum. One point I want to make is that's really interesting, isn't it? Then those will actually be a refuge, won't they? In other words, when you achieve Buddhahood, Buddhahood will be a complete refuge from all kinds of dissatisfaction, problems, and suffering. When you realize the Dharma will be an actual refuge, completely protecting you, and so on, from suffering. Also, bodhicitta, right, is when you regenerate bodhicitta, right, the wish to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings. We're aspiring to that result, aren't we? So in that sense, bodhicitta is connected to this version of resultant refuge. So what you could say when you generate, Gyume Khenpo Rinpoche said this, when you generate bodhicitta, you're actually practicing of the resultant form of refuge, right? You're trying to become that, right? And actually, in that sense, one other point I'll make is there's also, in the vehicle of individual liberation. First of all, they wouldn't say they take refuge in the Buddha in that sense, right? They would be taking refuge, if you're practicing only to achieve your own enlightenment, only your own liberation, then you wouldn't be taking refuge in the Buddha in the resultant sense, that you're not trying to become a Buddha, right? That's not the way you're thinking. But as a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner, one is striving to become all three jewels for the welfare of others, right? And oneself, by the way. So this is a uniquely Mahayana form of refuge, if that makes sense. It's a unique to the great vehicle, right? That you're taking refuge in all three jewels as you wish to achieve them in your own continuum. So that's another point. And we'll get into what they mean in a minute, but so you get the point there. So in this sense, Gyaltsab Je says one of the more meaningful of the two ways of interpreting the seven Vajra points in terms of how they're related is that Maitreya is beginning by looking at the result that will arise within your own continuum of being. And why does he start with the result? Right? Usually you might say, well, the causes come first before the result, so why start with the result? And he said, and Gyaltsab Je says, that is in order to give us a chance, by learning something about the resultant state we're trying to achieve, will generate enthusiasm, energy for trying to achieve it. So, when you hear about the amazing qualities of the resultant state of being a Buddha, and what the Dharma is, and what the Sangha is, and so on. Oh, great. That's the text. Thanks, Frank. And Lisa, he put the text in, so you know that you've asked for it. So by learning about the three jewels, we develop an enthusiasm and energy, motivation to achieve that resultant state. And then, actually, here I'm going to read something from Gyaltsab Je. I'm going to read actually a little quote here from Gyaltsab Je about this. He says, the final three jewels, right, this is what I was just describing. The final three jewels, right, the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel, are the fruition of one's objective, right? They're the result. For it is certain that only they constitute the marvelous perfection of the two aims. And ultimately, and I want to say something about this too, the two aims, this phrase. So the two aims are the aims, or sometimes the aims or purposes of yourself, and the aims or purposes of others. And so what he's saying here is, it is certain that only the three jewels, and so this means only by achieving the three jewels, by becoming the three jewels yourself, do you achieve the marvelous perfection, right? The wonderful completion, the marvelous perfection of the two aims. I want to pause there and just say, like, this phrase two aims, that I'm doing this actually. Sometimes people get confused about this point, right? So that the purpose of Dharma practice as a Mahayana practitioner, right, is to achieve both the welfare of others and your own welfare. Some people think that, some people, well, I mean, sometimes we leave out the welfare of others, of course, right, when we lack enough compassion. But also sometimes we get confused and leave out our own welfare, right? We forget, sometimes we can forget that too. And what he's getting at here is that this practice fulfills both. Does that make sense? So it's not leaving others out, it's also not leaving yourself out. And the ultimate achievement of your own welfare is when you achieve the Dharmakaya, right, the wisdom body of a Buddha, you fulfill your own welfare. And what does that mean? It means that, and actually that's an important point in Buddhism. I think sometimes people, people get confused about this. I remember reading an article once, what was it? His name? oh, it was Pope John Paul II. So the Pope went out some years ago. He didn't know much about Buddhism, and he wrote some article criticizing Buddhism. Remember, and he said like he because he was saying that people should be Catholic, I guess, but he was criticizing Buddhism, saying it overemphasizes suffering, that it only talks about how everything is suffering, and that he was sort of arguing that he argued this in a text. I'm not criticizing him as a person, but just in this one text, he said Buddhism just says everything is suffering. And actually, I thought, oh, that's totally no. He didn't understand Buddhism at all. Nobody explained it to him correctly, because what Buddhism is actually saying, and Gyaltsab Je is saying it, all Buddhists actually, is that actually Buddhism is saying, first of all, your nature is Buddha nature, and the achievement of your own welfare is bliss. Actually, that your deepest, that when you realize the nature of your own mind, of your own being, your experience will be freedom and bliss. Continually, even as you compassionately and lovingly engage with infinite others. Like, so you'll express compassion through enlightened activities endlessly, and effortlessly. Actually, we're going to get into this later. This is the resultant state, but that Buddhahood itself is an effortless, non-conceptual, totally blissful engagement with others, completely compassionate engagement with the world, while creatively and skillfully benefiting others. And at the same time, your own inner experience is one of blissful, joyful freedom. So anyway, it concludes the fulfillment of your own aims, is part of the point I'm making, right? This resultant state. Then he says, I'll skip a little bit here. It is also certain that there are two aspects. This is getting at the 7 Vajra points now. So he says, it is also certain that there are two aspects to the cause of the accomplishment of the fruitional 3 jewels. Right. So here he's saying, in terms of these 7 Vajra points, the 3 jewels, then, in this way of interpreting them, or looking at the 7 Vajra points, are the result. And they're presented first so you can understand how they marvelously achieve the 2 aims, the aims of yourself and the aims of others. Right. Then he says, there are 2 causes for that accomplishment, basically. There's this, and this is true in Buddhist teachings on dependent origination, that there's a substantial cause and contributing conditions. So what's a so I just want to, this is Buddhist, these points, these terms come from Buddhist philosophy or descriptions of reality. But what it's getting at, substantial cause is the main cause of a thing, right? Like, so, and oftentimes an example is given, that if you want to grow a certain kind of, like, let's say a plant, like a peach tree, right? A peach seed is the substantial cause, right? It's the main thing without which that will not arise. And then that's the way they sometimes describe it, the thing without which the result cannot come about. But then there are also cooperative conditions that are needed, like earth, soil, water, sunlight, and so on, that are not the main substantial cause. They're not another way of describing the substantial cause is it's that which transforms into the resultant state. But then there are cooperative conditions that are needed for things to arise. And so he says, in order to achieve that resultant state, there needs to be a substantial cause as well as cooperative contributing conditions. And one difference is, right, like the contributing conditions of, say, in my example of soil and water and sunlight, is that those are necessary for apple trees, peach trees, pear trees, blueberry bushes, blueberries and strawberries and so on, right? Those are, but the substantial cause is unique to that kind of result. Then he says, so what's the substantial cause of the 3 jewels and what are the cooperative conditions? And then he says, the substantial cause is the element, meaning it's your Buddha nature, right? So he says the substantial cause of your own achievement of the 3 jewels is that you have Buddha nature. He says, which is the suchness reality mingled with taints. For if the element were not naturally pure, then since it would be untenable for incidental taints to be removed, there would be no enlightenment. Right? So he's saying, what is I covered this briefly last time. Your Buddha nature is the how do you say it here? The naturally pure reality or suchness, the emptiness of your own mind, while it's still mingled with mental afflictions, taints, and their imprints. And he's saying, but they can be removed, right? And the fact that they can be removed means that you can achieve enlightenment. Then he says, anyway, I'm not going to quote every sentence here, but then he says, so this spiritual potential. Oh, something else. This spiritual potential of yours, right, your Buddha nature, is the productive cause of your own achievement of Buddhahood in the future. Then he says, the second aspect are the cooperative conditions. Then he says, these are enlightenment, excellence, and enlightened activities that have been accomplished by other beings. So in this sense, the way he's presenting it, right, the way this of the two interpretations of 7 Vajra points. So the 3 jewels are future attainment in your own continuum, right? You someday will become those 3 jewels. The main cause of that is your own Buddha nature, right? That already exists within you, and is covered over or mixed with or hidden by your mental afflictions, but by its own nature is pure. We'll get into many analogies for this, but one traditional analogy is like gold buried, it's like gold hidden in the earth, right? Under the earth, which is, say there's mud and there's all kinds of stuff there, but underneath it is pure gold, and that gold is pure, right? It stays pure, but it's hidden. So like that, our Buddha nature is hidden within mental afflictions, but it's there, untainted and ready to be uncovered if we go through a process of uncovering it. That's the cause of our own future attainment of the 3 jewels. Then he says, what's the cooperative condition, right, that allows us to uncover that golden Buddha nature? And he says, the cooperative conditions are the enlightenment, the excellences, and the enlightened activities that have been accomplished by others, by other beings. So in this presentation, right, it's others. So like Shakyamuni Buddha achieved enlightenment, right? And now he had enlightened qualities and enlightened activities. And those are the cooperative conditions, right? I'm using him as an example. You could also say Tara or other Buddhists, right? Maitreya himself. But it's the achievement of enlightenment and then the qualities and the activities that others have achieved, right? And when we interact with those others who have achieved that, that interaction allows us or helps us to awaken our Buddha potential, right? And for it to be purified so that it can be, so that we can achieve the 3 jewels. Yeah. And then he says an interesting sentence here. He says, there are no more than external conditions in the sense that other beings, having become perfectly and completely enlightened by the training in the wheel of Dharma, are what make the thorough purification of one's own taints possible. So this is really an interesting point, I think, just to contemplate. This line that Gyaltsab Je says. So what he's actually saying is, you already have primordially this Buddha potential, this enlightened potential, this potential for enlightenment, for Buddhahood within you. And he says, how did he say it there? I want to find the exact phrasing again. He says, there are no more external conditions that needed, essentially, right? So in other words, all we who are not yet enlightened need to do is we already have this Buddha nature within us, but we have to relate to others who are enlightened, right? And to allow their enlightened activities to influence us, right? And that will naturally cause our Buddha nature to be revealed. And so I just want to emphasize, in a sense, that's refuge practice, isn't it? So you could say, in one way, refuge practice is taking refuge in our own future attainment of the three jewels. That's one way of thinking about it. And another way of thinking about refuge practice is that, we don't have the capacity to uncover, to purify the taints that cover our Buddha nature alone. That we have to, what's the word? Allow ourselves to be influenced by the activities of somebody else who's already become enlightened. In order, for example, particularly to understand emptiness. Right? Lama Tsongkhapa, in his on the morning after he achieved his own realization, his own enlightenment, he wrote a beautiful poem called "The Praise to Dependent," praise to Buddha for teaching dependent origination, in which he says something like, it's because you taught the meaning of dependent arising as emptiness, and the meaning of emptiness is dependent arising, that you're worthy of praise. And he says, because that teaching is not taught by others. That teaching is totally unique. He says, it's the deepest teaching on the nature of reality, on the nature of one's own reality, of one's own being. And that it's hard to come across such a teaching, such an explanation of reality, right? You have to check if that's true. Tsongkhapa checked that for his own experience and realized it. So we can check, but this is what Gyaltsab Je is Tsongkhapa's student, right? So he's saying it's by interacting with the enlightened activities of others that we purify or awaken or realize our Buddha nature, he says purify the taints that cover it. That's the way he puts it. So let's leave it like that. So that's another way of thinking about refuge, isn't it? Is that refuge is in part, what's the word? Making a choice if one wants to, right? To open up to the enlightened activity of previous Buddhas in order to achieve our own Buddhahood. So there are two ways that, that's another way of thinking about the practice, right? So do you see, this is one way of understanding the relationship between these 7 Vajra points, right? That by relying on the enlightenment with its qualities and activities of another, we can purify the taints that cover our own Buddha nature and achieve or become those first 3 Vajra points, the Buddha jewel, Dharma jewel, and Sangha jewel. I'll now briefly mention, there's another, because Gyaltsab Je says it, right? There's Dokla Tsawa says there is another way of interpreting these 7 Vajra points, another way of seeing their relationship. And but Gyaltsab Je says this one's a little less profound, actually, and it's not the sort of final intent of, not the most profound intent of what Maitreya was doing, but it's still not incorrect. So just mention it briefly. The other way of thinking about it is that the 3 jewels, right, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, you could think of those also, because it's correct, they also exist in the continuum of others. So you can think, okay, I'm taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha outside of me. Why? In order to awaken my own 4th Vajra point, Buddha potential, right? And if I awaken that Buddha potential and purify it by taking refuge in the 3 jewels outside of my continuum, then I will eventually achieve enlightenment, the 5th Vajra point. Right? And once I achieve enlightenment, I will have the qualities and the activities of enlightened Buddha, right? So that'd be a different sequence. You see what I'm getting at? And both sequences make sense. So one is emphasizing the 3 jewels as something, one is presenting 3 jewels as future attainments oneself, right, as a resultant refuge. And in that sense, then the enlightenment, the qualities and the activities are in the continuum of another. The other way of doing it, right, is the 3 jewels. If you think of them as in the continuum of another, then you would think of enlightenment, qualities, and activities in your own continuum. So they're both valid ways of looking at the 7 Vajra points as they relate to each other. In the end, they come down to the same thing, though, don't they? So that's what Gyaltsab Je is saying. They're both reasonable. Is that in both cases, what it's describing is a process, right? And the process is you already have the limitless potential, right? That is your Tathagata Garbha, your I'll just say, Buddha nature, your Buddha potential. And therefore you can achieve the resultant state of full enlightenment. And how do you do so? right? By, you say, taking refuge in, right? Others who have already achieved that state. And it's interesting, isn't it? So it's also getting a kind of continuum of enlightenment too, isn't it? That we have this potential, but it's also getting at, I mean, Gyaltsen Jay said it. We don't, in order to achieve that resultant state, we have to relate to others who have already achieved it. And it's interesting, isn't it? You could have Buddha. Actually, we've had a Buddha. The Buddha nature is what's the word? Has always been there. It's a continuum that goes back to beginningless time. There's no beginning to it, because it's the nature of them. It's the ultimate nature of mind itself. So why hasn't it already arisen? Why hasn't it already been purified? Why aren't you already a Buddha? And what this, what Gyaltsen Jay is saying is, there's really, he says that there are no more, right? The only external condition needed is to relate to the three, is to relate to the enlightened activity of others, essentially, right? And I'll just share for myself as I contemplate this, this teaching. Now you can see refuge becomes very deep if you contemplate it, right? It's not just, because if we take refuge just saying, I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, well, those are words, right? But if you ask yourself, when I contemplate this sometimes, right, I'll wonder, well, so why isn't my Buddha potential fully revealed yet, right? And then you have to explore, well, what are the ways in which I'm not, what's the word? I'm not allowing the enlightened teachings to purify my taints, right? Because the problem isn't that there aren't Buddhas who have taught, right? Like right now, even the Dalai Lama recently said this. He said actually, this is considered, in general, these times are considered a degenerate era. And then he said, but if you've heard the teachings, then it's not a degenerate era for you. It doesn't have to be a degenerate era for you. In general, it's a degenerate era in the sense that there's a lot of anger and ignorance and craving and destruction and greed and so on. He says this point. He says, it doesn't have to be a degenerate era for you, right? Because you have access to the teachings. So it's up to you if it serves as that function of being degenerate for you. That's individual choice. And so part of this practice of refuge, implicit in the way this presentation is, so I'll ask myself, wow, so I've heard the teachings, right? I know the teachings for how do you purify my Buddha nature, right? But if I don't apply those teachings, right? If instead I say, well, yeah, those are great, and as soon as I'm done being greedy or angry or something, then I'll apply those, right? Well, then I'm making it a degenerate era for me. Does that make sense? And I'm not I'm not allowing the teachings to do what, so the problem isn't like the Buddha taught dependent origination, right, as emptiness. Those teachings still exist. So, and they sometimes give an analogy like this. If you imagine like, if the sun is shining, but you don't, but you, what's the word? Hide under a blanket. And then you can say, well, the sun isn't shining on me, right? Because I'm hiding under a blanket. It's up to us, right? In other words, do I allow that sun in or not? I'm using a metaphor here, right? This is part of the practice of refuge, right? Am I actually doing the process that would allow my Buddha nature to awaken? Or am I doing things that actually stop that? And that's a question I'm just putting out there. So now you see what I'm getting at, as you think about these points, and we'll just say more points. I'm hoping people are starting to get a sense, this is why I call this text a meditation. Right? This is a meditation on refuge now, isn't it? In other words, do I believe that I can become the three resultant jewels? Right? Do I believe that I have a capacity for endless, blissful, compassionate, skillful, loving, creative engagement with all sentient beings? Do I have a capacity for omniscience? That's what a Buddha is, right? For infinite compassion, for infinite joy, for infinite love, for infinite bliss, and so on. So one is, do I believe that? So do we? These are contemplations that we're going to explore as we go on. But this is why it's a meditation, right? Now it's no longer I just saying the words, I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then, do I agree with Gyaltsab and Maitreya and Asanga's assertion that I have a Buddha potential, and that engaging with the enlightened activities of others can awaken that fully? And actually, if you believe that, then are you, again, this is refuge practice. We ask ourselves that. Well, then am I, what's the word? Am I doing with my precious moments as a human being what makes sense to do or not? Right? These are questions that one would contemplate in the context of these teachings, right? And you see how a person, if you really contemplate these deeply, a person might develop more enthusiasm for actually like, wow, this is possible. I can engage in that practice, and I can awaken in that way. And you check for yourself, but that's what this teaching is exploring. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. I want to say more about the 3 jewels and so on, but I want to pause there just to give a chance, because that was a presentation just of this first verse, really, of how do the 7 Vajra points relate to each other. It's kind of introduction to that topic, but it's important because the rest of the text is about that. So I want to pause there, and just in case anybody has questions about that before I go on to some related points. But okay, no questions. I just want to make sure, because it's that's kind of a foundation for the rest of the text. Then there are other points that are made that are worth noting. One is Gyaltsab explores this also in his commentary. I'll say it this way. One point that Gyaltsab makes, so it's just worth noting, I think, is that as a Mahayana practitioner, right, he actually raises, the way Gyaltsab says it is, he says, well, we're trying to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings. So Gyaltsab says, one could ask, he kind of raises it like that. Many Buddhist texts do this. If you read Chandrakirti, he also does this a lot. He says, somebody might ask, well, why not just say the Buddha jewel? Why do you have to include the Dharma jewel and the Sangha jewel? Right? Because you're trying to achieve Buddhahood. And then he makes a number of points. One is, when you become a Buddha in the future, your natural activity will be to teach the Dharma. That's the main way you benefit others, right? So the Dharma. So that's why it says in that one verse I read. There it says, I read it out loud earlier, but it says, from the Buddha, the Dharma, right? So when you become a Buddha, you'll naturally express the Dharma to benefit others, right? And then it says, from the Dharma, the assembly of Aryas, right? The assembly of those the noble ones who have seen reality, right? So that means one point he's making is, well, when you become a Buddha, you'll naturally teach the Dharma. And when through your teaching of Dharma, this others will become the Sangha. So that's one way of understanding that. Then another way of understanding that he explores, I think is interesting, is he says, it's true actually that Mahayana Buddhists focus mainly on the Buddha jewel because they're trying to become that. And then he says, he makes some interesting points. He says actually, hearers, right? Shravakas, like so. Yes, I would say Shravakas or hearers. That's usually the translation. Focus mainly on the Sangha jewel, right? And so they mainly, because they're disciples who mainly at the time of the Buddha, right, or soon after the Buddha passes, they practice in a community, right, of other Sangha members. And they listen to the Buddha, and that's why they call Shravakas, hearers. They listen to the words of the Buddha or to the disciples of the Buddha, and they achieve their own liberation that way. And so he says, so their main refuge is actually the Sangha, the community. And then he says, and Pratyeka Buddhas, right, or solitary realizers, they don't want to, they don't want to be around when a Buddha's around. They want to achieve enlightenment alone. That's why they're called solitary realizers. And they don't like particularly to be among other Sangha. They're kind of loners, you could say. some Pratyeka Buddhas achieve enlightenment alone, completely alone, others in a small community, but they don't talk. Actually, they like to be they like to be alone. So their primary refuge is not the Buddha, in the sense that they have to study with the Buddha in a previous life, but their vow or their aspiration is to achieve enlightenment when a Buddha is not around, actually. And their main refuge is not the community. So their main refuge is the Dharma. They hear the teaching on dependent origination and they think about it for lifetime after lifetime in order to fulfill their wish to achieve enlightenment alone somewhere. They're, when there's not a Buddha present, meaning. There are some that are congregators who achieve enlightenment with some other Pratyeka Buddhas, but even then they don't talk much, they don't teach through words. So another point he's making is there need to be three kinds of resultant states to benefit you. You have to achieve them to help these three kinds of disciples. So that you need to know all of those in order to benefit others, is another point he makes. And then he gives another teaching also where he explains that actually, in a sense, you'll become the Sangha jewel when you achieve the Arya state, right? Once you become an Arya, actually, you'll become the Sangha then. You become the Sangha. When you realize emptiness directly, you become the Arya Sangha. And then you've realized the Buddha in your own continuum, you've realized, the Dharma in your own continuum, the Dharma jewel. And then eventually through that, you'll become the Buddha jewel. And there's more about that I'll cover later, but that's a brief explanation. But it leads to something that I wanted to emphasize today a little bit now, which is, in terms of the 7 Vajra topics, particularly the 3 jewels, but also all the 7 Vajra topics, there is a presentation that I think is really important as we go forward to understand, which is, and it's useful to contemplate and to think about for our practice, my practice, your practice, our practice, which is they're what are called relative and ultimate versions of each of the 7 Vajra topics. So I want to kind of describe those. And each of them is worth thinking about. For example, I'll use the example when you take refuge, for example. So we'll start with the Buddha jewel, right? The ultimate Buddha jewel is the Dharmakaya, right? Dharmakaya meaning the truth body, right, of a Buddha, which is actually not a body, a physical body. It's a mental, right? It's the Buddha's. But Dharmakaya means, in a sense, is the Buddha's mind. You could say it's also. I say in a sense because it also includes the Svabhavakaya, which is the emptiness of the Buddha's mind. So it's the Buddha's mind and its ultimate nature as well. And the way Gyaltsabje says it is the Dharmakaya, of which the perfect eliminations of all the mental afflictions and their imprints, and the perfect achievement of exalted wisdom are its defining characteristics. So that's the ultimate Buddha jewel. And then he says the relative Buddha jewel is the material body of a Buddha. So do you see the point there? So when you say I take refuge in the Buddha, if you're thinking of, say, Shakyamuni Buddha, right? In his posture, with holding his hand down, touching the earth, and holding his other hand, holding a begging bowl in meditative posture and so on. That's the relative Buddha, right? That's the relative Buddha jewel. The ultimate Buddha jewel is the mind of the Buddha, right? Is the Dharmakaya. Actually, there's a famous verse in the Vajrakuta Sutra, right, where the Buddha says something like, I'm not going to remember, I may misquote slightly, but I'll get the essences here. He says, those who by my form did see me, saw me or knew me not. The Buddha is the Dharmata, right? The Buddha is the truth. The Buddha is the realization of the truth, right? So when you say, actually, so it's interesting, right? Because actually, I'll just say now, I asked earlier, how can the Buddha protect you, right? Can the Buddha protect you, and so on. So if you say, I take refuge in, and then you think of the relative Buddha, right? The form body of a Buddha. Well, in some relative sense, having a relationship with the Buddha may provide protection in the sense that then you study the Buddha's teachings, right? And so on, and practice them. And that may eventually then help, that does help your mind, is the idea. So that is a relative refuge, right? But in the end, the actual ultimate refuge is, in this sense, is when you achieve the Dharmakaya, right? In other words, when you achieve the Buddha's, when your mind becomes a Buddha's mind, first point, one point is you'll then no longer have Buddha nature, because Buddha nature is reality mixed with taints, as it's mixed with the mental afflictions and their imprints, right? At that point, you won't have any mental affliction or imprints. So you won't have a Buddha nature anymore. You'll have the Dharmakaya, right? And at that point, you'll be utterly free from all, as he says, as Gyaltsab said, right? You'll achieve the marvelous, capacity, right? Aiwachi says it here. You'll have the perfect elimination of all mental afflictions, which are the causes of suffering. The perfect elimination of all the imprints of mental afflictions, right? Which means like the obstacles to omniscience. And you'll have achieved perfect exalted wisdom, which includes the perfect exalted wisdom understanding conventionalities, so you understand how to benefit others, and the perfect wisdom that understands the nature of reality, so you're utterly liberated from suffering. Right? So you see the point there. So when it says, now you see the profundity of just contemplating, I don't know, check for yourself what you think of it, but this is the point they're making, is that will actually be a protection, right? When you achieve that, you'll be protected from all suffering or imperfections, actually. I'm going to pause there. So that's the ultimate Dharma, Buddha jewel, Buddha refuge, right? One thing Khensa Rinpoche pointed out was he said, and that is the final, he kind of said, that is the final protection, the final refuge from imperfection. And then he said, of course, if we don't yet have that Buddha jewel in our continuum, then we have to find, temporary, that's the ultimate refuge. Then we have to find, as beginners, our beginning of refuge is not harming others so that we don't harm ourselves, and so on. So each level of practice has its own practices that protect us from certain kinds of suffering, right? But then the final ultimate refuge is the Dharmakaya itself. So that's an explanation. I'll go into that more, but so that's the ultimate and the relative Buddha. In terms of Dharma, the second of the 7 Vajra topics, the ultimate Dharma are the true paths and the true cessations in the continua of bodhisattvas. Okay. So this is because it's Mahayana context here. So, right, bodhisattva is somebody who's realized bodhicitta, which means it's effortless, right? That their experience of bodhicitta is continual and effortless. We can give rise to kind of a initially, which actually is how you develop, by the way, how you develop effortless bodhicitta is you over and over again give rise to a kind of contrived bodhicitta. Whereas you make effort and you kind of you think of the suffering of others, you think of the benefits of helping them, you think of how they undergo all kinds of problems, and you develop compassion and you think, I want to help them. And you keep thinking about that until you give rise to a strong feeling, right? That's a kind of contrived bodhicitta, which is good. That's the only thing we can do at the beginning. And by doing that over and over and over, eventually it becomes natural and spontaneous and our kind of baseline state, where we're always in that state. Then you've realized bodhicitta, right? So that's a bodhisattva. And when a bodhisattva achieves true paths and true cessations, then they've achieved in their mind, right? So the Dharma is actually something inside the mind, inside the continuum, you could say, inside the mental continuum of such a bodhisattva, right? So an example of a true path is when they have the direct realization of emptiness, right? That'd be an example. Right? And on the first bodhisattva bhumi, right, when a bodhisattva achieves that direct realization of emptiness, they achieve the cessation of all acquired, like all wrong philosophical understandings. They can't give rise to them anymore. So cessation means permanent stopping of those kinds of things. So those are the Dharma, right? So when a bodhisattva, or like there's an example, different levels of bodhisattvas. There's this point where a bodhisattva, through their realization of emptiness, has a cessation of anger, meaning they can no longer give rise to hatred or anger towards others. They don't have that anymore. That's a cessation, right? And how is that? That's a true protection, right? That's the final protection, in the sense that when you have a cessation of a mental affliction, well, mental afflictions are the cause of your suffering, right? So when you have a cessation of the mental afflictions through your realization, then that becomes a protection. ultimate protection for oneself, right? So that's why the Dharma is a protection. It's just these true cessations and true paths in the continua of bodhisattvas. The relative Dharma means the teachings of the sutras and the shastras and so on, particularly the sutras, I guess, but their commentaries, you should say. So the texts and the oral traditions, if we receive the oral transmission, listen to a guru teach on them, or we study them, then that's the relative Dharma. And part of one point that was made in the Uttara Tantra is, it's through engaging with the relative Dharma that you come to eventually realize the ultimate Dharma, right? So whether that's listening to a guru, for example, teach on it, or you're reading the book and studying it and contemplating it, you're engaging with the relative Dharma, and eventually you achieve the ultimate Dharma, meaning the realization of the true paths and true cessations, and then that becomes the actual protector of yourself. You get the idea here, though. The ultimate one is actually in the mental continuum of a being, yourself or somebody else. And then the Sangha jewel is the ultimate Sangha, or is the knowledge or wisdom, knowledge, wisdom, or liberation in the mental continua of Arya Bodhisattvas, right? So Arya Bodhisattvas are bodhisattvas who have realized the nature of reality. And so the Sangha jewel is actually what's inside their mental continuum, what's in their minds, right? Their inner realizations and their inner freedoms. The relative Sangha are the assembly of those Arya Bodhisattvas, when they're together somewhere, right? And you see them, that would be the relatives, or if you think of them, right? So if you think of, there are like 8 great bodhisattvas who were disciples of the Buddha, like Avalokiteshvara and Manjushri and Samantabhadra and so on, Vajrapani. And, so if you think of them, that would be an assembly of bodhisattvas that are the relative. But the ultimate Sangha jewel are the realizations and the freedoms in their mental continua. And again, I want to pause here. Do you ordinarily, I want to think back, I asked you earlier, when you said, I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, what were you thinking you were taking refuge in, right? What comes to mind? Was it these things? Was it the inner realizations in the minds of Arya Bodhisattvas that give them freedom, that give them skillful means, that give them bliss, and so on? Was it the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, the wisdom body of a Buddha? And was it, and if it was it the wisdom of the Buddha that realizes emptiness, or was it the wisdom of the Buddha that realizes all conventionalities, all conventional phenomena in order to skillfully help others? Or was it the emptiness, Svabhavakaya, the nature body of a Buddha, the emptiness of the Buddha's mind? Was that what you were thinking of when you said, I go for refuge to the Buddha? Or was it, which would be the ultimate Buddha refuge, right? Or was it the material body of a Buddha? Were you thinking of like the material, some form body of a Buddha? Or was it something else? And same thing, right? The Dharma, where you think of the true cessations and true paths and inside the mind of yourself when you achieve it, where you think, wow, someday I'll have the cessation of all the sufferings and all the causes of suffering in my own continuum, right? In my own being, through my realization of the ultimate truth in meditative equipoise. And that will be my experience. And that's what I'm taking refuge in. Wow, that's amazing. Is that what you were thinking or not? And do you see how now, so the practice of refuge is very profound, right? And there are all these practices we can do, like if you actually sometimes we do them at the center, right? We sit down and we say, Namo Guru Bhye, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, da, da, da. Then you go on and you chant some, if you hang out with Tibetan monks, they'll do that. And also, which is the verbal expression of refuge. But now you see, you could sit for hours just thinking about, what does that mean? Am I taking refuge? What would it be like to take refuge? What would it be like to experience the cessation, to experience the paths, right? The Arya paths, the noble paths of realizing the ultimate nature of reality. And what would it be like to have the Dharmakaya? What are the qualities of a Dharmakaya? That's what this text is eventually going to explore, right? What is that? What is the Dharmakaya? And so on. Because that's what we're actually taking refuge in, right? And so then it's amazing, right? Like, in other words, your practice of refuge becomes very, very deep, and wonderful, like something wonderful, like, and there are all these like tantric sadhanas that start with refuge, right? But actually, like, Khentsur Rinpoche once said, he said, if you just took refuge and then stopped and thought about that, that's good enough. Sometimes, like, because if you understand the meaning of refuge, actually all the other teachings are there, right? Because you're thinking about because, for example, the true paths and the true cessations, that means that's the realization of emptiness, the realization of bodhicitta, and so on. So it's all there in the practice of refuge. So those are the ultimate and relative of the three jewels. Then of the fourth of the, I'm just going to go through the rest of the Vajra points, right? The seven ultimate and relative levels of each of the Vajra points. So those are the three jewels. Then the element, right? Which is element means there are different Sanskrit words. We'll go over them sometime. Like, there are all these different Sanskrit words, Gotra and Garbha, and we'll go over them. But I'll just say element or Buddha nature. So the ultimate element is, I'm actually going to use Gyaltsab Je's definition here of the ultimate element. The ultimate truth of suchness mingled with obscurations, which is the emptiness of inherent existence of the mental continuum of a sentient being. Right? So the ultimate element is, whether it's in your sentient being means you or somebody else, right? So a sentient being is somebody who's not yet a Buddha, right? So it's it has to be mingled with obscurations. That's why. So it's not yet a Buddha, right? It's still mingled with or covered over to some extent by obscurations. And he gives two different phrases which are synonyms: the ultimate truth of suchness, or the emptiness of inherent existence of the mental continuum of such a being, right? So that would include yourself, though, right? So what is the element? It's the ultimate truth of suchness. Suchness means like as it is, right? Or the ultimate truth of the emptiness of inherent existence, right? So it's the lack of inherent existence, or the ultimate truth of suchness, of your own mental continuum and of the mental continua of others, right? Of people, of insects, of animals, of all different kinds of beings, right? So that's when we say Buddha nature, that's the ultimate referent for what that term means. Then also there's a relative referent for Buddha nature. And that, again, I'll use Gyaltsab Je's definition. It is the ability possessed by sentient beings' minds to produce transcendental qualities. So that's a valid conventional definition, right, of that. So it's the ability any sentient being, but think of yourself, right? So it's the ability of your mind, right? It includes one of the, you and others, but the ability of your mind here to produce transcendental qualities. And again, I just want to pause. So that's worth contemplating, right? Do you recognize? Because actually, first of all, do you recognize using the ultimate one? To what extent, I'll ask, because this is a matter of degree probably, but to what extent do you recognize that your mind, that it has an ultimate truth nature, which is the emptiness of inherent existence? Well, that's quite hard to recognize, isn't it? Recognize the nature of your mind, ultimate nature. But even the conventional one, actually, do you recognize that your mind has the capacity to produce transcendent qualities? And actually, do you feel that way? Like, can you actually feel that? My mind has the capacity to give rise to transcendental, amazing, marvelous qualities. The marvelous qualities of bodhisattvas, the marvelous qualities of a Buddha. And one point I'll make is, to generate bodhicitta, we actually have to feel that, don't we? Because if you say bodhicitta is the wish to, it's the, to put it simply, you say it's the wish to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings. That's we can give a more elaborate definition, but that's a simple definition. So the wish to achieve Buddhahood or enlightenment means you have to believe it's possible to achieve Buddhahood or enlightenment, right? Yourself. And actually, do you feel, many times we say we suffer from low self-esteem sometimes or something. Well, this would be like spiritual self-esteem question. Like, can you actually feel, I have the potential to become a fully enlightened Buddha, totally equal to Shakyamuni Buddha? right? Totally equal to any Buddha, equal to the medicine Buddha, equal to Tara, equal to Avalokiteshvara. That's my capacity. That's my ability. Well, that's what this is getting at. So this is something to contemplate. I'm just presenting it that these points are not just philosophical; they're things to contemplate. And part of the goal here is to feel that eventually, right? If you study this teaching enough that you feel, wow, I have this capacity to give rise to those kind of qualities, then this teaching will have served a great purpose, right? Because it'll be easier to develop bodhicitta. It'll be easier to practice the path. Yeah, because sometimes I think that it's an obstacle to practice, isn't it? If you don't believe the result is possible, you're not going to engage in effort to achieve it. And then for the enlightenment, right? So next one is enlightenment. Enlightenment here, so that's the fifth Vajra point. So the ultimate enlightenment is the truth body, or the Dharmakaya, which is the place of fulfillment of oneself, which is the ultimate truth body, the ultimate reality body of a Buddha. Right. So I'm making 2 points here. One is it's the ultimate fulfillment of your own needs. Right. When you achieve that, everything you need is now achieved. Everything will forever. That's the idea. And the relative enlightenment is the material bodies of Buddha. Gyaltsab Je then says, someone may ask, what is the difference between enlightenment and the Buddha then? Right? Because the Buddha was defined as the Dharmakaya, and enlightenment is defined as the Dharmakaya in the ultimate. The relative Buddha was the material body of a Buddha, and the relative enlightenment, and the relative of enlightenment is the material body of a Buddha. And then Gyaltsab Je says, here meaning in the Uttara Tantra text, the difference is whether it's being referred to in the continuum of another or in the continuum of yourself. Right? So when we say Buddha, we're talking about the Dharma, in the way Gyaltsab Je emphasizes, it's the Dharmakaya that you will eventually achieve, and the material bodies of a Buddha that you will eventually achieve. Whereas here we say the truth body, enlightenment, is the truth body, the Dharmakaya. We're saying in the continuum of another, right? In the continuum of somebody else who's going to help you awaken your own Buddha potential. And the relative truth body, the relative enlightenment are the material bodies of that other being who already achieved enlightenment, who's going to help you. And why is that important to us? Well, actually, we can't perceive yet the truth body of that other being, right? I can't see the truth body of Shakyamuni Buddha until I achieve a truth body myself. So I need to relate to the material body of Shakyamuni Buddha in order to listen and study those teachings. So that's the difference here, right? Is that the first Dharmakaya material bodies are your own eventual achievement of them yourself. Here under enlightenment, it's the Dharmakaya and the form bodies or material bodies of a Buddha in the continuum of another who's helping you. Then these next 2 points I'm just going to cover briefly, and then we'll cover them more in detail later. But the sixth Vajra point are sometimes it usually says qualities, right? The qualities of enlightenment, or the excellences. One translator calls them excellences of enlightenment. So the ultimate referent of that are what are called the 32 excellences of freedom. And these are 32 qualities. They're actually, I won't list all of them, but there are 10 powers, 4 fearlessnesses, and 18 unique qualities. So those are qualities of a Buddha. Those are qualities of the Dharmakaya, which we'll study as we go through the text. So I'm not going to describe them right now, but because we'll study them. But they're qualities that you'll achieve when you achieve Buddhahood. And why are we going to study those? Again, so that you understand what the goal is, right? We say, I take refuge in the Buddha, right? So we say, I take refuge in the Buddha, which the ultimate referent is the Dharmakaya. But actually, if we don't know the 32 qualities of freedom, then by understanding what they are, we'll better understand what the Dharmakaya is that we're trying to take refuge in. Wow, you're going like, wow, I didn't know all this for refuge. Usually I just say I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But then you say, well, am I thinking of the 32 qualities of the Dharmakaya when I achieve them? Do you see how this deepens one's practice of refuge? And I want to make another point here. One point is, by by studying these things, we'll think about them, right? And you can just practice like that. But then once you've thought about them, you'll also then, what's the way to say it? They'll, even when you don't explicitly think about them, once you contemplate them a lot, they'll be there in the background of your understanding of what you're taking refuge in. Does that make sense? It's like, I want to give it a couple of analogies here. Like if somebody says, I don't know, if somebody describes, a silly example here. But if somebody says, okay, I'll give an example. If somebody says, oh, Rome is a wonderful place. If you've never been to Rome, right, and you don't know much about it, you might say, oh, that's interesting. I don't know. Like, and you have some vague idea of Rome, right? Then if you read a few books about Rome, right, you have a different understanding, right, of what Rome is. Then if you go visit Rome and come back, you have a different understanding. Then if you were to like live in Rome for 5 years, right, each of those you would have a very different understanding of what that place is, right? The first is just a word, right? You might say Rome, it's a city, and that's all you know. Okay, so and so said Rome's an interesting city, right? That's different than reading a history of Rome in some books. That's different than visiting there for a few days, and that's different than living there, right? And if you've lived there, then you know Rome in a very different way than somebody who just heard the word. And you don't have to think of all your experiences in Rome; you just know it. Does that make sense? I'm just using that as a metaphor, obviously. What we're trying to do here is you may have heard of Buddha, right? Maybe you read a book, something. Now what we're trying to do is deepen our understanding of where we want to go. I'm using Rome as an example because somebody might want to travel there, right? Here we want to travel to Buddhahood, right? So now you want to, like, what's the word? You want, this is a deep guidebook. Something like the Uttara Tantra is like a deep guidebook to where you're trying to go, right? So then you'll know how to get around. You'll know like what I'm using. I'm being silly for a metaphor here, but you get my point. It's to try to understand that resultant state more deeply, and if you contemplate it, it's like the more deeply you actually, I guess when you realize, in my analogy, I guess when you realize emptiness would be like a visit. You're not yet living there. It's like a visit. So we're trying to get more and more familiar with that place. So anyway, the ultimate referent for the excellent qualities are the 32 excellences of freedom, which include the 10 powers, 4 fearlessness, and 18 unique qualities. And the relative are we'll say what these are later in detail, but the 32 excellences of development. So on the way there. And then the last Vajra point, the activities. The ultimate activities, referent for the term activities, there are two different translations that both are of the same Tibetan. So I'll just read them both so you can compare them. One is the all accomplishing intuitive wisdom, or you could say the exalted wisdom that the exalted wisdoms that accomplish activities. Right. So it's a kind of wisdom, and I said this earlier. Buddhas don't have, conceptual minds are dualistic, and Buddhas don't have conceptual minds. So Buddhas accomplish their activities by way of an intuitive wisdom or by way of an exalted wisdom. So that's the activities. The ultimate referent is the wisdom in the mind, in the mental continuum of a Buddha that spontaneously accomplishes activities. You could say it that way. That's the ultimate referent for the activities, the 7th Vajra point. And the relative activities, the relative reference for the term activities of a Buddha is the sutra literature. So, or is the teachings, in other words, the teachings of the Buddha. Which, and that's a profound point. I'll just make one more point here, one more thing to think about. Actually, in that same poem I mentioned earlier by Lama Tsongkhapa, the praise to the Buddha for teaching dependent origination, he says, among all your activities, so Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at this point, enlightened activities. That's why I'm mentioning it. He says, among all your activities of speech are supreme. Your activities of teaching, in other words. Because, what's that famous verse? The Buddha said, I can't wash away, the first noble truth is suffering, and the second is the causes, right? Buddha's making a point. I can't wash away your suffering and its causes with water or with some kind of external salve. I can't wipe them off you, with my hands. So he didn't say it that way, but I'm elaborating for a second, right? And the Buddha said, I can teach you the truth. and if you contemplate it and meditate on it and study it and practice it, then you can apply it, and that's how you can liberate yourself. So even the Buddha said the same thing Lama Tsongkhapa was saying, which is the supreme enlightened activity of a Buddha is the Buddha's speech, is the Buddha's teaching, right? And so if we study those words and so on, and I was just the other day, I came across a quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who said, he was just giving some advice, and he said, there are so many books now on the Dharma books, teachings. And he was saying, like, he was giving advice, and he said the thing to do is read them slowly and think about them. Read a few lines and stop and think, and then read a few more lines and stop and think. He was like, that's a really great way to spend your time. That's relating to the enlightened activity. You're then, that's a form of taking refuge, right? You're trying to relate to the enlightened activity of the Buddha. And sometimes I think, when we take refuge, sometimes we're guilty of this, where we think the Buddha is going to do some magical thing, right? Like you say, oh, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and please send some kind of, like, I don't know, something that knocks this thing over, or does some magical, does something like that then everything will be okay, or whatever. Once I read a book where it was not a Buddhist book, it was a novel, but it was called Praying for Sheetrock. Somebody needed sheetrock for their house, so they were praying to God for a sheetrock. And then I think the sheetrock fell over, and it was like a funny book. They dropped sheetrock, and the person says, "Oh, God answered my prayers. Now I have sheetrock." Refuge is not like that. You're not praying for sheetrock, or whatever. Praying, what it's getting at here is refuge means, like the Buddha said, I'm not, the Buddha didn't, I'm not going to, what's the word? I don't wash away your suffering with water and with soap. The Buddha was saying, I teach the method, right? The path. And if you practice it, that's the refuge, right? And actually, I'll just share this small aside. Recently, I was up in Connecticut. That was very funny. There's a certain part of a Buddhist ritual that Khenpo Rinpoche was doing. You met Khenpo Rinpoche, one of my teachers, was a wonderful teacher, was doing a ritual. And there's a certain point where the Lama in this ritual gives you water and you drink it, and then he sort of stopped and he started laughing, and he said, the Buddha said, I don't wash away your suffering with water. So he said, so why am I giving you water? What's the meaning of this? And then he said, you have to think of emptiness. He said, actually, the water is not the main point. He said, yes, I'm giving you water because it's part of the ritual. He said, but actually the blessing comes if you recognize water is empty of inherent existence, and I'm empty of inherent existence, and drinking it is empty of inherent existence. And if you take the blessed water in that way, then it becomes a blessing, an actual blessing. Otherwise, I'm not sure who's the point. So you see what we're getting at here. This is getting at the deep meaning of what are the reference of these terms, right? The 7 Vajra points. I want to pause again, and we just have a few minutes left, but I want to see, do people have questions about, now I've covered a lot of material. I just want to give a few minutes for questions. Jan, yep. Oh, Jan, yeah, you're muted, though.
Okay, now, am I muted now?
No, now I can hear you. Yep, you're good.
Now you're muted, Jan.
Oh, you remuted yourself. You were good, but now you're remuted. Maybe I can unmute you or something.
Unmute.
Oh, now you're good. You're good.
Am I good? All right. When you were going through actually the 3 jewels and all this, what came to my mind was Guru Buddha, that your teacher takes on that aspect, and that's really what it's about, what you were explaining. It kind of clarified that for me, and I get it. And I'm very grateful that I heard what you said, because now it does. I can say, oh, okay, yeah, well, if you're around somebody who's practicing all the time, you know, who conveys information, but, and that then is, for all practical purposes, your teacher is Buddha. Got it. So thank you.
Great. That's great. Well,
Yeah.
one small point I'll make is actually that's what the teachings actually, that there is what the teachings actually say is, you know, are the body, like when you think of the Lama or the Guru or something, you know, that they actually, the same point, you know, this is not from the Uttara Tantra, but in general in the teachings it says this, that the physical body of your guru is just the relative guru, right? The ultimate guru is the Dharmakaya still, you know, so in other words, it's the mental, you know, so actually when you think of your guru, you know, sometimes we think of their body, of course, like I may think, oh, my guru, I think of the body, but that's just the relative referent. Actually, the ultimate term, the ultimate referent for that word actually should be, they sometimes say, the mind of transcendental wisdom realizing the nature of reality, or that sort, you know, so it's the same idea that the relative guru is the physical form that we need in order to hear something, but the ultimate referent for that term is still the Dharmakaya. Yeah,
Right.
you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And
Thank
then
you.
Ryan,
I just wanted to say, well, I thought this was it was an incredibly revealing lesson for me today. I sit down at my shrine over here and meditate every day, and I do my refuge prayer, and I have my statue of Buddha and Tara, and I have Avalokiteshvara around my neck, and picture of His Holiness, and it's always been, we're going for refuge to like these, without thinking about external things, like a dualistic concept. And I never really thought about it in the sense of it being like a conventional form versus like when you laid out the ultimate form of each of these jewels. I'm pretty excited to see what it's like to try to go for refuge to the ultimate form, you know, in here as opposed to up there in my shrine. I never thought about it like that before, and so I just thought today's lesson was just like a for me. So thanks.
it's a wonderful, that's why, I mean, that's what this text is like. I mean, from my experience anyway, for me, that's what this whole text is like. It's like, wow, you know, like it deepens our practice. And I'll just say, Ryan, as you do that, like to sit there, and actually I'll just share my own, this is just my own experience. This is not from the text, but like in terms of the dualistic thing you were mentioning, like one thing I find fun actually is to go, if I try to think, okay, what's the ultimate referent for Tara, you know, in your example, right? And then what's the ultimate referent for the Dalai Lama? What's the ultimate referent for Avalokiteshvara? And then to go like, and to go, wow, sometimes I'll think, it's like the feeling in me is like, as if, I don't know, as if like Shakyamuni Buddha is over here and Tara is over there, you know, as if they're like, and then like, but it's the Dharmakaya, you know, like Tara's ultimate referent is the Dharmakaya. Shakyamuni Buddha's referent is and my mind wants to, what's the word? There's not a word for this, dualistic guys, as if they're all, you know, as if I'm over here and Tara's over there, and, you know, Lama Tsongkhapa's over here. Anyway, whatever. But my point is just to experiment, like to notice how our minds do that, and then to go, wow, the referent is, you know, and that Tara is my own future attainment of the Dharmakaya.
It's like getting a reference point for like the more subtle look at it.
Yeah,
lets you see that the grossness of the practice before that you weren't able to see because you didn't have context for that before. It's like opening a window. Yeah, I mean, you said this reading is like a meditation in and of itself, and like I think I get that now.
Yeah, that's my experience for sure with this. Great. Any other comments? Oh, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think about this a lot. And I know that the first time I studied, you know, the difference between the conventional versus the ultimate jewel, you know, that really, it had a big impact on me. And I think from one perspective, there seems to be a lot of sense in separating the three jewels because it gives a different sense of inspiration with each one. But then, you know, the profundity of it, I think, is to realize that emptiness ties all of those jewels together. So emptiness in the sense of the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, emptiness in the sense of, you know, the realizations and sensations in the mind of an Arya, and then the same thing with regard to the jewels, the Sangha jewel, just that particularly that inspiration existing in beings that we may meet. So just no surprise, right? I mean, emptiness is the key to everything, right? Whether we call it the element or the Dharmakaya or whatever. So yeah. Thank you very much, Lauren. That was a great discussion.
Oh, sure. John, I think you made a good point. One just quick comment I'll make about it is like, actually, there's this teaching that in the Uttara Tantra, we'll get to it at some point, where they talk about like, we said like the element, right? The Buddha nature is the emptiness or suchness, or ultimate emptiness of inherent existence or suchness of the mental continuum of ascension being, right? Which is what you were just saying. It's emptiness, At one point, and then later we'll study this in the Uttara Tantra, but really interesting. They say, so there's one where it's like, fully covered, so like an ordinary sentient being who's not an Arya yet, who hasn't seen emptiness directly. And then they talk about the emptiness, this is still a Buddha nature, but, because it's still a sentient being. But so that for an ordinary being, it's, the emptiness of the mental continuum that's powerfully obscured by mental afflictions. Then for Arya Bodhisattvas, they say it's the emptiness of the mental continuum of beings that's partially uncovered and partially covered. It's still the emptiness of their mental continuum, but it's like partially uncovered because they've realized emptiness now, and they have the cessations, right? They have the Dharma jewel in their continuum, and then a Buddha is no longer called Buddha nature because they're a Buddha, but the Dharmakaya is the emptiness of the resultant state of that, right? It's still the same continuum, but now it's no longer a Buddha nature, it's Dharmakaya. So it's another way of getting at your point, though, that they're all, the referent of all of those is an emptiness, but that emptiness can be fully covered over with mental afflictions. It can be partly covered and partly uncovered, or it can be fully uncovered in the state of Buddhahood. And it's just for me, I find that interesting. It's getting at your point. It was an interesting, for me, way of contemplating. But we have to stop in a minute. Any other comments or questions before we stop? Oh, Frank. Yep, last one.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Great class. So just to clarify, the Buddha nature is it be defined as the Dharmakaya but it's muddied by obscurations and mental afflictions, but what we have the Dharmakaya within us?
Well, first I'll say, like, Gyaltsab Je's definition, and I'll read it again because he says the ultimate the ultimate definition would be of the ultimate version is the ultimate truth of suchness mingled with obscurations, which is the emptiness of inherent existence of the mental continuum of a sentient being. So he says that's the ultimate reference. And his point, the way Gyaltsab Je presents it, he'll say sometimes that you'll see texts that say, it's the Dharmakaya, like the Dharmakaya covered by mental afflictions. And Gyaltsab Je says, that it's important to understand that it's not actually the Dharmakaya. That's a kind of linguistic, that does appear in the sutras. That is a linguistic kind of usage, but to understand that it's only metaphorically the Dharmakaya. It's not the actual Dharmakaya. And one way of saying that Gyaltsab Je sort of notes is, because part of the definition of the actual Dharmakaya is it has the 32 excellences. And among the qualities of the Dharmakaya is that it's omniscient. And so, he would say, you can't literally say that something that's omniscient doesn't know it's omniscient. So there's sentient beings have an omniscient Dharmakaya that doesn't know it's omniscient. That would be self-contradictory. So he makes this point. He says, so you can't say it's literally the Dharmakaya covered by mental afflictions, because then it wouldn't be the Dharmakaya. That's not how the real actual Dharmakaya is defined. So he says, but sometimes you can say, there are different uses of terms, and he'll say, we can say use the term Dharmakaya there to refer to the ultimate suchness or the emptiness, meaning that, but then it would be giving the result something that'll be like, I don't know if he says this phrase, but sometimes in Buddhism we do this, where we name, like we name the result by its cause. So like you might, like if you see it's like when somebody sees I don't know, sometimes people will look at a cute little baby and they'll say, hey, hey, little man. Well, they're not literally a man yet, but they're referring to this, that it will eventually become a man, so to speak. So it'd be like that. So it's a referent, but the actual referent is not, it's not literally the Dharmakaya, because some people interpret it as if it is. There's some Buddhist texts or Buddhist writers who have said that, and Gyaltsab Je then makes this argument. He says, the actual referent for the term Dharmakaya has to have the 32 excellences. It has to have realized the ultimate nature of reality. It has to have realized all conventional phenomena. And you can't say actually that a person who is under the, is obscured by mental afflictions has those qualities. So you see my point there. I just think that's an interesting way to present it.
Thanks. Good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, but we can say that linguistically, but we have to know what we're referring to then or something. Yeah. But, oh, thanks, Larry. But okay, well, I guess we should stop there. And the classes for October, I guess this is the last one for September, but the classes for October are already up on the calendar on the website. So it's October 7th and October 21st. And soon I'll post some classes for November and December probably too. So, but we've got the ones for October already there, so we're good. But I'll post some, working around Geshe Sherab's visit in November. I'll post some classes for November. And we should be back to the hybrid with in-person and remote next class. I think, yeah, we should, by October, it should be fine. So that's the plan as of now. But thanks, everybody, and we'll just do the dedication. So, Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, so that the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. In particular, through studying the Uttara Tantra, may we all come to recognize our Buddha potential, our Buddha nature. May we succeed in actually taking effective refuge in the enlightenment and enlightened qualities and activities in the continuum of those who already have achieved enlightenment, in order to thereby eliminate our mental afflictions and their imprints, to fully reveal our own Buddha nature, our own Buddha potential, and achieve our own state of enlightenment and become the actual 3 jewels for the welfare of others. Well, thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord.
Long.